Like many of us, as a kid, one of my purest sources of joy was Star Wars. Whether it was the original trilogy, prequel trilogy, Lego Star Wars, or accidentally hitting your friend's fingers too hard during a plastic lightsaber duel, it didn't matter, I was having a good time. But then towards the end of the early 2000s, a dark influence fell over the land that in subsequent years would come to be known as social media. And at the time, I was corrupted by it. As a preteen, my very much still developing prefrontal cortex was steeped in the opinions of countless online weirdos in the form of Facebook fan pages, YouTube videos, and podcasts. This unrestricted access to social media warped my development in many ways which are best not discussed in a public YouTube video. But one thing about me it changed, which is apparently appropriate for a YouTube video, is of course my opinion on Star Wars. While debates in the Star Wars community were lively at the time, one matter felt largely settled. It was that the Star Wars prequel trilogy sucked, and you'd have to be a stupid baby to like those movies. Me, of course, being 12 and eager not to be seen as a stupid baby, promptly changed my opinion. I was now exclusively an original trilogy fan. But fast forward to the early 2020s and we begin to notice a change. Pockets of the fan community begin to shift and a sentiment emerges that the prequels were secretly good this whole time. For many, this recent wave of positivity was confusing. But to understand why, we have to understand why the prequels were so hated in the first place. Here's the thing, if the prequels were just bad movies, nobody would have cared and they would have been forgotten. But these weren't just any movies, they were Star Wars. The original Star Wars, now known as Episode 4, A New Hope, was an absolute phenomenon when it released in 1977. In 2025, it's hard to imagine what this would have been like. The release of a special effects heavy action blockbuster movie is downright ordinary today, but what these people were lined up for was anything but ordinary at the time. This movie was an entertainment experience truly unlike anything else in human history up until this point. Never before had such a fantastical world been brought to life in such an exciting and visually convincing way. Spaceships, lasers, droids, a war between a galaxy-spanning totalitarian empire and an underground guerrilla rebellion, as well as the mystical, transcendent, life-connecting force ignited the imagination of millions. All of this with a deeply relatable story of self-realization at the center that spoke to the hearts of people in an increasingly instrumental and scientistic culture. For many, this wasn't just a movie, it was a borderline religious experience. Likewise, its two sequels, The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, were incredibly well received and cultural events in their own right. And then, nothing. People waited 16 years for a follow-up movie, and when one was finally announced, rather than being a straightforward sequel to Return of the Jedi, this movie would instead be set prior, with an almost entirely new cast. The Phantom Menace would be the first chapter in an origin story for series antagonist Darth Vader, and would document the fall of the Jedi and rise of the Empire. And when the movie finally released in 1999, people felt, well,
thumbs way down.
You didn't like it?
No, I think I deserve a public apology from George Lucas.
A common thread in many of the reviews at the time was that this movie was lacking the human element that made the original trilogy so great, instead simply being a vehicle for special effects. Critic Todd McCarthy called it easily consumable eye candy, but with no nutrients for the heart or mind. Still, there were many positive reviews at the time. Popular film critic Roger Ebert gave the movie 3.5 out of 4 stars, calling it an astonishing achievement in imaginative filmmaking. And general audience perception was more positive. That summer, Gallup conducted a poll of 3,000 people. Of the 396 who had seen the movie, 79% gave it a good to great rating, while only 21% gave it a medium to negative rating. Still, I think it's fair to say that overall opinions were mixed, which was a far cry from the almost universal praise the original trilogy had received. The prequel trilogy at best maintained this mixed mainstream reputation throughout the early 2000s, with the two follow-up movies, Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, doing very little to shift public opinion. So maybe the prequels weren't quite as good as the original trilogy, but really, what could be? After the dust settled, people sort of forgot and moved on with their lives. Or so they would if this were any other franchise. Remember that for many, the original Star Wars was legitimately a spiritual experience. To those people, the prequels weren't just less than great movies, they were an attack on their god. And now we were heading into the 2010s and the rise of social media. This meant that the minority of people who deeply hated the prequels were given far more public platforms compared to the relatively niche online message boards they would have been relegated to previously. Because of this, harsh criticisms of the prequels would become much more mainstream. The CGI was ugly, the acting was bad, so boring, too much politics, midichlorians, you're ruining Star Wars. This was the kind of online discourse I wandered into as a preteen, and I was convinced by it at the time. It was hard not to be. Many of the criticisms were well argued, and the trilogy's negative evaluation felt universally agreed on. Even The Simpsons told me that the prequels suck. The prequels largely maintained what I would classify as an extremely negative reputation for many, even to this day. But as we discussed earlier, this wouldn't be the only opinion. Since the beginning of the 2020s, a new movement in the fandom began to gain steam. It was that the haters were wrong and the prequels were actually good. Whether through Reddit threads or YouTube videos, there was definitely positive will. For example, people were happy to see Ewan McGregor and Hayden Christensen return to their roles in the recent Disney Plus shows, despite the, we'll say, dubious quality of some of those. Another example of recent goodwill towards the prequels is of course r/prequel memes, a subreddit joined by 3.8 million people. When this subreddit was created in 2016, to me its posts seemed to come from a place of irony in order to mock the prequels. But scrolling through here in 2025 doesn't have that feeling at all. Legitimately, every line of these movies have been turned into a meme of some sort, demonstrating an intimate knowledge of them that, to me, has a tone of genuine affection. Despite this small wave of positive opinion, many would write it off for two main reasons. The first being nostalgia. The people who grew up with the prequels were now entering their 20s and 30s, the perfect age to emerge as an online Star Wars opinion sharing weirdo. The second reason for this shift in public opinion, some argue, is comparison to the new Disney sequel trilogy. While opinions on episodes 7 and 8 were, for the sake of this video, let's say mixed, relatively few were pleased with how this new trilogy concluded in episode 9, with it being the lowest rated movie in the entire series on IMDb. Basically anything would look good next to that movie, so the idea goes. To me, these were plausible explanations, but something told me there might be more going on here. To the point where I finally decided I had to see for myself. I went into this rewatch not sure where I would land. I was the right age to enjoy these movies, but I was fully bought into the online hate for years. Still, I went in with an open mind and relatively fresh eyes, having not actually watched these movies for probably 15 years. When sitting down to watch The Phantom Menace, I have to admit, I felt nervous. It felt like I was going to meet an old ex. How different would things be after all these years apart, I wondered. Initially, things were actually going pretty well. I was reminded of all the good times we had together. But then, about 15 minutes in, a certain character appeared and I began to remember why we went our separate ways. And look, I know the last thing this world needs is another internet video shitting on Jar Jar Binks, but Jar Jar has this off-putting character design. As a child, this dude genuinely creeped me out. Personally, I don't think an uncanny fish person with sinister yellow eyes was the best choice for a child-friendly comic relief character. Somehow this thing manages to look both leathery and slimy, and the pronounced human teeth are just bizarre. To make things worse, his dialogue is borderline incomprehensible. I've had to rewatch some of his scenes with subtitles, and even that didn't help. There were a handful of lines that I had to Google just to see if anyone knew what the fuck he was talking about. In the years since the release of The Phantom Menace, Jar Jar has become the symbol for everything that people hate about the prequels, and honestly, I can understand why. When he's on screen, I can't help but feel embarrassed. Like, really, I'm a grown-ass man spending weeks of my life writing an essay about this stupid cartoon. During Jar Jar's introduction, all of this flooded back to me, and I was feeling silly for thinking this new wave of positive buzz had any substance to it. But there was an element of his introduction to the story that encouraged me to withhold judgment and keep an open mind. At this point in the story, our Jedi friends Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan have snuck their way onto the planet Naboo. Without transportation, the two must find a way to make it to the capital city to notify the Senate that Naboo is under attack. Qui-Gon literally runs into Jar Jar and, like us in the audience, is immediately annoyed and asks Jar Jar if he is brainless. But instead of outright refusing to engage with this creep like I would, Qui-Gon realizes that Jar Jar might be useful for his goal in gaining transportation to the capital, so he decides to go along with things. And this ends up working out for Qui-Gon because Jar Jar almost immediately gets them their transportation. Through this, I felt like the movie was encouraging me to look past appearances in order to see the larger story unfolding. And it was through this perspective that I felt my mind beginning to change about The Phantom Menace. I was intrigued by how Qui-Gon handled the introduction of Jar Jar, and I was interested in following this character to see how he would handle other situations. And after finishing the movie, I gotta say, I found Qui-Gon to be surprisingly compelling as a lead character. Seeing him navigate his way through the plot, applying only as much pressure to a given situation as needed, was fascinating, I thought. It seemed like he never had any concrete idea of how he was going to get to the next step in his journey, repeatedly running into brick wall after brick wall, but he never seems to feel any anxiety about this. He's a character that has the wisdom to know that no matter how obscure a problem is, a solution will present itself to him. Perhaps in unsuspecting ways, like through Jar Jar, who, besides getting Qui-Gon his transportation, ends up being the key to unifying the surface and underwater civilizations of Naboo in defense of their planet. For Qui-Gon Qui-Gon, this sort of thing happens repeatedly. Later, Qui-Gon's ship breaks down, so he is stranded on the desert planet Tatooine. To make things worse, he learns that his Republic credits aren't accepted here in the Outer Rim, so he is unable to buy parts. But Qui-Gon is completely unbothered, simply saying, "Alright, I'm sure another solution will present itself." Jar Jar ends up causing even more problems, but this facilitates a meeting between Anakin and Qui-Gon, which cascades into a series of events culminating with Qui-Gon getting his ship parts and recruiting Anakin to the Jedi Order on top of that. What I found so compelling about this is that Qui-Gon is this character that is open to finding meaning in everything. In the world of Star Wars, all events are subtly guided by what these characters call the Force, meaning that to them, everything has its purpose, and Qui-Gon genuinely believes that. But what's interesting is that this sets him apart from even the other Jedi we meet. Later, Obi-Wan remarks to Qui-Gon that he would be given the rank of Master if he'd stick to the Jedi Code, but Qui-Gon just says he'll do what he must. Qui-Gon does what he feels to be correct, not what he is told to be. And the reason why I found a character like this to be so compelling is that in the hellscape of apparent meaninglessness that is the modern world, watching this character who sees things as having their place and happening for a reason is almost medicinal. Whether in actuality there's some sort of metaphysical entity like the Force orchestrating things, I don't think is important for this point. Just the idea that we can find meaning in challenges and setbacks by seeing them as opportunities is a healthy, empowering way to approach life. Qui-Gon shows us what this looks like, and it comes with a complete lack of pessimism, and I think that's downright inspirational. Like, if Qui-Gon can find meaning in the cosmic absurdity and borderline nihilism that is the antics of Jar Jar Binks, maybe in my own life I can find meaning in the absurdity that is writing an essay about a stupid cartoon, for example. Because of this, it's fair to say that I enjoyed my time with The Phantom Menace, and I was looking forward to the second movie, Attack of the Clones. But upon starting it, I began to have my reservations because almost immediately I found our new protagonist, Anakin Skywalker, to be pretty unlikable. He comes across as arrogant and whiny, and watching him and Obi-Wan bicker is uncomfortable.
And you will pay attention to my lead. Why? What?
He's emotionally volatile as well, which we can see in an early interaction between him and Padme, in which Anakin has an unprompted vent session where he says that he thinks he's ahead of Obi-Wan and he is ready to take on the trials to become a full-blown Jedi, but he feels the Jedi Council is holding him back. I was tempted to turn the movie off at this point because this overgrown baby was so abrasive, but then I remembered the patience of Qui-Gon and decided to consider things from Anakin's perspective. When I did that, I found a surprising amount of depth to this character. Anakin is directly stated to have the most latent strength of any Jedi, even above Yoda, but the tight leash he's held on by Obi-Wan and him being refused to take the trials indicates that the Jedi don't treat him as anything special, which bruises his ego for sure, but I think it hits something a little deeper inside of him as well. What Anakin is literally asking for here is to be accepted. He wants the Jedi to say to him, "We see your talent and we think you're fit to be one of us." This would mean everything to him because he admires these people. To Anakin, the Jedi represent all that is good and heroic in the world, and it's understandable why he thinks this way. Even as a kid, Anakin heard legends about the Jedi, and he was literally freed from slavery by one. For Anakin, approval from the Jedi would be the ultimate confirmation that he is good and heroic. But there's an even deeper layer to this. At this point in the story, I think Anakin is desperate to get approval from anyone. In the previous movie, Anakin left his mother to join the Jedi, this person who was an unwavering source of love and recognition for his entire life up until that point. And given that the Jedi explicitly forbid emotional attachments, it's clear that they are unable to help him process that loss. What all of this reveals is that Anakin has been completely emotionally isolated for the last 10 years between films. He must feel completely invisible, which explains why he boasts about himself and acts like a show-off. He is starving to be seen. After reflecting on this, I decided I would not turn off the movie and instead finish watching it. And in the end, I was only kind of glad that I did. This is not a very good movie. It's ugly in places. Basically, no story happens in the last 45 minutes, and a massive portion of screen time is given to a romance that just doesn't work at all. The dynamic between Anakin and Padme is absolutely rancid. Anakin is a character whose childhood attachment wound has left him emotionally stunted to the level of a 9-year-old, but whose body and hormone production have reached sexual maturity. Because of this, he is hyperfixated on a woman he hardly knows and repeatedly crosses her personal boundaries. And Padme shuts this down decisively at every opportunity.
It makes me feel uncomfortable.
Sorry, milady.
From a storytelling perspective, I actually don't have an issue with this. It all makes sense for the history and psychology of these characters. The problem comes when the switch is flipped and Padme decides that she does like Anakin, which happens for absolutely no reason as far as I can tell. This is a shame because it undermines the realism of these characters and makes the screen time dedicated to this romance feel completely wasted. But there was exactly one scene between them that did work well for me. Obi-Wan is kidnapped and the other Jedi explicitly order Anakin to stay put and guard Padme, but Anakin is very nearby and knows he can help. Still, every interaction he's had with the Jedi in this movie has made Anakin feel like he can't do anything right, and desperate not to be seen as a bad kid, decides to follow orders and not rescue Obi-Wan. Still, he clearly doesn't feel good about this decision. Padme recognizes this, and knowing that Anakin is capable of helping, decides for herself that she is going to help Obi-Wan, so Anakin would be defying orders not to come with. This is a small scene, but what it does for Anakin is kind of beautiful, I think. In this moment, Padme recognizes that Anakin is skilled and wants to help, and by taking action, she enables him to express that. This right here is the kind of acceptance that Anakin has been desperately seeking from the Jedi, and through this one action, Anakin's 10 years of feeling completely invisible is over. Despite the many flaws of this movie, I have to admit the character stuff here worked for me, and I was excited to revisit the final movie, Revenge of the Sith. But honestly, this was one that I was already looking forward to anyway, because it was a movie I still remembered fondly even after the years of online slander. And after this rewatch, I'll say it, my transformation into a full-blown prequel fan was complete. Many of the problems I had with Attack of the Clones were mercifully absent from this movie. The pacing is far more brisk and it looks way better, with colorful, well-directed space battles and atmospheric, moody lighting reflecting the underlying tension and uncertainty that the characters are feeling. The movie leans into the silly, bombastic, melodramatic side of the previous two, resulting in a tone shift from the stilted high school stage play of Attack of the Clones to an otherworldly, removed-from-time epic. Anakin is no longer unbearable to watch. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that he's charming and likable, with a beautiful new haircut and scar, completing the bad boy look that the space leather jacket alone previously only implied. I like the way Anakin looks in this movie a whole lot, and I'll just leave it at that. But the reason that Revenge of the Sith turned me into a prequel fan came from more than just its fun campiness. In rewatching it, I found myself thinking that the conclusion of Anakin's story and transformation into Darth Vader came together beautifully here, and I felt for the character, which is a compliment I think some might be confused by. The movie wants you to think that deep down Anakin is a good person, but for some, it's hard to believe that because he is just so cartoonishly evil. Also, Anakin isn't very convincing in explaining himself.
From my point of view, the Jedi are evil!
Because of this, I've heard many say that Anakin just isn't a sympathetic character, which I do understand. But there's another layer to this that I think is interesting. This perspective isn't unique to Anakin in the prequels. I've heard people say something similar about the character we saw Anakin as back in the original trilogy, Darth Vader. When we're introduced to Vader in A New Hope, we first see him as this hulking authoritarian monster who works as an enforcer of the Empire and is abusive to his employees. Initially, his only real function in the story is to be a symbol of tyranny for Luke and his friends to fight against. But by the end of the trilogy, Vader's character becomes more fleshed out, and he's even given a supposed moment of redemption where, in a decisive moment, he sacrifices himself by throwing the Emperor in a pit to save his son. Just like with Anakin's character arc in the prequels, I've heard some people say that they don't really connect with this moment. It's almost a meme at this point that, sure, it's good to throw a space fascist in a pit and it's nice that Vader did that, but it's hard to say that this one action redeems him, because up until this point, he spent decades being insanely murderous and evil. Many would say that this one good thing Vader did can't make up for all of that. It's just too little too late. Before revisiting Revenge of the Sith, I held this view myself, believing that Anakin's fall to the dark side in the prequels and his redemption in the original trilogy were not especially sympathetic. But what ended up dispelling that for me was again the patience and open-mindedness taught to me by my spiritual teacher, Qui-Gon Jinn. Remember earlier I was initially put off by Anakin's brattiness and the uncomfortable romance in Attack of the Clones, but when I approached that movie with an open mind, I found that these elements of the story were understandable and admittedly kind of interesting. Likewise with Anakin's dark side moments throughout the prequels, I found them to be understandable as well. The first major example of this comes from Attack of the Clones and Anakin's encounter with the Tusken Raiders. Throughout that movie, Anakin has future-telling dreams warning him that his mother is in danger. Anakin is advised advised by his mentor Obi-Wan to simply ignore the dreams, and Anakin, trying his best to be a good boy, initially follows that instruction. But eventually the dreams become too overwhelming for him to ignore, and he goes to see his mother, who he finds on the verge of death, kidnapped and tortured by the Tusken Raiders. In a blind desire for revenge, Anakin slaughters the entire village. It is really easy to condemn Anakin in this moment, because it is so cruel of him. But when we approach this from a place of understanding rather than judgment, everything about it adds up. Keep in mind at this point, Anakin is at peak feeling unseen and unrecognized, and the perfect example of this is how Obi-Wan advised him to handle his dreams. The Jedi, being mystical monks, deal in the realm of prophecy and omen, so it would seem reasonable for Obi-Wan to at least consider that Anakin's nightmares might be a genuine premonition. To me, this implies that Obi-Wan isn't telling Anakin to ignore the dreams because he thinks there is nothing to them, rather that he just doesn't care if Anakin's mother is in danger, which lines up because with the Jedi ideology of non-attachment, he'd have no reason to. So not only is Anakin feeling devastated that he didn't prevent the brutal and deadly treatment of his mother, he's also feeling totally betrayed that Obi-Wan's advice led to this outcome. When considering everything leading up to this moment, you can imagine the white-hot frustration and rage broiling inside of him. He'd have to have a god-tier mastery over his emotions to dispel that in a healthy way, and I have a hard time expecting that from the emotionally repressed and sexually frustrated teenager that Anakin is. What I appreciate about this is that honest and ugly moments like this in stories help us understand and even forgive our own nastier moments. Attack of the Clones makes Anakin understandable by showing us how frustrated he is, and what I love about Revenge of the Sith is that it continues this trend. But the emotion built up for Anakin in this movie is desperation. It begins this by showing us that Anakin's future-telling nightmares have returned to warn him that this time Padme's death is imminent. Remember that to Anakin, Padme is his emotional refuge, being the only other character who he feels seen by. The idea of reliving the trauma of his mother's death with this person he's so dependent on creates an absurd level of anxiety in him. And what's tragic is that Anakin does take reasonable steps by asking for support from the people around him. He confides in Padme, and the Jedi both advise him to just let go and let it happen, which would be fine if he didn't have someone whispering into his ear that there is another way out. I'm talking, of course, about the man who will become the Emperor of the original trilogy, Sheev Palpatine. Throughout the prequels, we see Palpatine slowly accumulate political power. He sees Anakin as a potential ally in this, and what makes this plot in the movie so juicy to me is that Palpatine understands Anakin. He recognizes the anxiety Anakin feels around losing Padme, and that after all this time, Anakin still wants approval from the Jedi. He uses his understanding of Anakin's psychology to tell him everything he's desperate to hear. He celebrates Anakin's wins, praises his judgment, and even gives him responsibilities. All of this while taking jabs at the Jedi to subtly undermine Anakin's appreciation of them. What this does is make Anakin start to believe that Palpatine is the only person being honest with him, and is thus the only person he can trust. This slow process of manipulation culminates in a conversation where Palpatine tells Anakin the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise, who, through the dark side of the Force, found a way to prevent those he loved from dying. At which point Palpatine goes full mask off, revealing himself to be a Sith Lord, sworn enemy of the Jedi. He tells Anakin that if he becomes his apprentice through the dark side of the Force, he can teach Anakin how to save Padme from dying. What I love about this is that you can feel why it is so appealing to Anakin. Palpatine is giving him the answers he desperately wants to hear, and he's letting Anakin feel seen in a way that the Jedi just don't. Where this becomes heartbreaking is that Palpatine clearly only wants to use Anakin as a means to gain power, which should be obvious to him, but he so badly wants to believe that this guy can rescue him, he'll look past all the red flags. And we see this come to disastrous results in the fight between Mace and Palpatine, where Anakin is forced to choose between Palpatine and the Jedi. Anakin, having been fully convinced that his only chance at happiness lies with Palpatine, begs Mace to let him live. Mace says that's too dangerous and goes to deliver the killing blow. Anakin shouts, "I need him," and severs Mace's hand, interrupting the assassination and cutting his ties with the Jedi permanently. At this point, I imagine some of you might be thinking, Peach Doors, where is this going? Are you just here to make excuses for this character who, while sure is in a tough situation, still chose to do really evil things? I can't help but notice that you cut your story recap short right before Anakin lightsabers a room full of children. What I'd say is that I'm not here to decide if this imaginary person was justified in doing evil. It's totally fine if you want to do that, but for me, this character and these movies as a whole blossomed in my mind when I just approached them from a place of understanding understanding. What I see in them now is George Lucas imagining a realistic human being with a well thought out past, who is talented, has dreams and anxieties, and just wants to be loved, and is also really hot, then put him in the exact wrong situation and showing us the tragedy of what unfolds from that, which is awesome. I love that about these movies. But another thing that approaching the prequels from a place of understanding gave me was a deeper appreciation for Anakin's story in the original trilogy as well. When we look at Vader in A New Hope after the context of everything that unfolded in the prequels, rather than seeing him as powerful and intimidating, we now see him as this sad, broken person who ruined their life after being exploited in a vulnerable position, believing that he had inadvertently murdered Padme, as well as being permanently disabled in his battle with Obi-Wan, now requiring an oppressive medical device just to exist in the world. Now Anakin motivates himself through a fictional idea of bringing order to the galaxy. He idealizes power in and of itself, but we notice that he actually has very little power of his own, being completely subservient to the whims of Palpatine. When considering this, Vader now becomes pathetic. And what's interesting is that he recognizes this on some level, adopting a defeatist attitude, saying things like, "It's too late for me, and it's useless to resist the Emperor." But Luke, rather than writing his father off as a lost cause, shows compassion for him. Luke sees and points out that if Anakin truly only cared about power, Anakin would have killed him in their duel. Through this, Anakin begins to realize that there is still hope for him. He does have a connection to his old life through Luke, and in not severing that connection immediately, realizes that deep down he wants it. So now when we watch Anakin overthrow Palpatine at the end of the movie, we understand that yes, this doesn't make up for all the murdering and fascism, though we also understand that through this action, Anakin is admitting his mistakes, that he was wrong to follow Palpatine and that doing so ruined his life. Now, rather than continuing to lie to himself and double down on that mistake, he's decided to break the cycle. Anakin's story is not one of redemption. It's not a story about figuring out who is right and who is wrong. It's a story about healing, and it shows us that this comes from understanding our past, admitting when we wish we'd done things differently, receiving compassion from people who love us, and choosing to change. Having said all this, and now considering myself a newly minted prequel fan, are the prequel haters right about me? Am I just nostalgic, or am I just comparing these movies to how vapid and empty The Rise of Skywalker is? I mean, that's definitely part of it, but also, these are weird, messy, personal, and interesting movies. These qualities are rare in a big-budget blockbuster, so I do think that's worth appreciating on its own. Still, this leaves me to consider one last question and an opportunity for introspection, if you don't mind indulging me. Why did I change my mind the first time? When I was a young teenager, why did I stop identifying as a fan of the prequels? Well, when I was that age, I admired the people online who were confident in what they thought about the media that they loved and hated. I didn't know quite how to articulate why I felt a certain way, so I looked to them to essentially validate my taste for me. And back then, nobody was validating the prequel enjoyers. But looking back now, despite some of the legitimate criticisms of these movies, I believe a lot of the backlash stemmed from the fact that these were just different from the original trilogy. They were simply not what fans were expecting from a new Star Wars, and that was disappointing to them, which is understandable. But the problem with that for me, which I didn't realize was important back then, was that those people's experience of the prequels simply didn't match my own. To me, these were just Star Wars, and as a kid, I didn't just love the lightsaber battles, music, and explosions. I understood what Anakin was feeling, and I connected with it. Even then, I knew what it felt like to lose someone you're attached to and the fear that you might lose someone else. I also understood how Anakin felt not getting the recognition from others he believed he deserved. Still do. Like and subscribe. It is kind of sad to me that during my teenage years, I was dismissive of the real joy I got from these movies as an 8-year-old, just so I could sound like a cool online film buff who had sophisticated tastes. I think making this video helped me move on from that. And it turns out making videos like this takes a lot of work, but I do love it. Unfortunately, I currently make $0 from this, so if you'd like to keep the channel alive until I'm able to monetize it, you can send a few dollars my way through ko-fi.com/peachdoors. If you believe in what I'm doing here and would like to offer ongoing support to the channel, you can do so at patreon.com/peachdoors. To keep up to date with me, you can follow me at peachdoors on Instagram and Blue Sky. Please take good care of yourself, and I will see you next time.